A very warm welcome to everyone who has joined this, our first in this webinar series, Taxing Times. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused a significant shock in the healthcare system across the world. This has also played out in the financial markets and also to an increasing extent in the real economy. If we look back over the past 100 years, there have been a number of global crises that have been experienced. There was the Great Depression, World War II, the 2008 financial crisis. What is interesting is that with each one of these crises, it's resulted in governments having to find extra ways to try to obtain that extra revenue required to fund the spending that was required. This has necessitated shifts in the international taxation landscape to accommodate the economic conditions of the day. COVID-19 has been described by the IMF as well as many other leading economists to have the same magnitude as that of the Great Depression. So with this in mind, it's very likely that the effects of COVID-19 will play out in a similar way to previous crises, in that we will have and see a significant shift in the taxation landscape. The purpose of this particular webinar series is to encourage discussion between taxpayers and revenue authorities during the crisis, so that we can get, hopefully, greater levels of alignment through the crisis, rather than waiting for higher levels of controversy to play out after the crisis. So in order to do this, we're going to be getting perspectives from both sides, in fact, from as many different angles as possible, from taxpayers, revenue authorities, other industry leaders. And the topics for the next several series, next several sessions, are what you can see here on the screen. So the first one today is going to be looking at the impact of global crises on the taxation landscape. Then in 2 weeks' time, we're going to look at how COVID-19 is impacting supply chains and value chains as it works its way through the real economy. We will then look at the transfer pricing and international tax considerations and look at specific technical questions that have been coming up and that are expected to come up. And then it's going to be important to get revenue authorities' perspective. What are revenue authorities wanting and hoping to see, and what will they expect in 3 years' time when they do an audit of 2020? What are the questions that they are likely to be asking? As we go through this series, we'd love to hear from you regarding other topics that you would find interesting or questions that you may have. Without further ado, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our two speakers who are joining us today. Many of you will know Keith Engel. Keith was a former director of tax policy at National Treasury. Keith is the CEO of the South African Institute of Tax Practitioners. Keith is without doubt one of the most enthusiastic and passionate tax people I've ever met. And Keith, it's always fantastic to hear your insights on policy and general tax topics. So thank you so much for making time to join us this morning.
Thank you, Michael. It's always an honor to be with you. And I love your enthusiasm as well.
Thank you, thank you. Then we've got Sebastien Guinard. Sebastien is a director of a French-based consulting firm called Accuracy. Sebastien is based in Morocco. He's also really passionate about transfer pricing in emerging markets. And in fact, Sebastien is a founder of an organization called Transfer Pricing Economists for Development. And they do a lot of great work in looking at issues pertinent to developing countries. So Sebastien, I think one of the interesting things for me is you spent time during the last crisis in a developed country in France. Now you're playing this one out in Morocco, so you're seeing things from both developed and developing sides. So really looking forward to your insights, and thank you so much for joining us all the way from Casablanca.
Thank you, Michael, and indeed we share the same transfer pricing passion.
Absolutely. We would like the session to be interactive, so I'd encourage you to make use of the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to ask questions during the course of it. We will monitor those questions and pose some of them to the speakers. At the same time, if your signal does get interrupted, don't worry, we are going to be recording the session, so you will be able to get the recording afterwards if you miss out on certain parts of it. So if we jump right into today's session, who would have thought this time last year that the world would have landed up being as crazy as it is today? What we're going to put up now on the slide is an indication of how an online application for communication has grown 30 times in terms of the number of users in the last several months. You can see that the Zoom usage rate increased so much to the extent that now, because of the use of Zoom and the digitization, and also the significant impact on the travel industry, Zoom has a market cap that is higher than the combined market cap of the top 7 largest airlines. Another interesting consideration is that the impact of COVID-19 has played out differently across different sectors. So what you see here on the screen is a graph showing grocery deliveries, online grocery deliveries, pharmaceutical purchases, fast food purchases, and clothing purchases. And these are stats taken from US numbers. And you can see for the first several months of the year, there was, they were all trending together. Come mid-March, there was a significant divergence in the impact of industry. And I know my wife and I, we've certainly contributed towards the spike of online grocery shopping in the last several months. So the question is, how does all of this play out? And it's been mooted by various thought leaders that there are likely to be one of 3 different scenarios that will come up. Firstly, is if we have a vaccine that's discovered and rolled out in the short term, well, then we're likely to have a V-shaped recovery. The second scenario is that if it takes longer and the vaccine and solution is only discovered in the medium term, then it's more likely to be a U-shaped recovery. The third scenario is to the extent that it takes a longer time for a vaccine to be discovered and rolled out, then it's more likely that there will be an L-shaped recovery. So different schools of thought, but I think one way or another, regardless of which option it is, it's clear that there's going to be significant pressure on governments to raise much needed revenue. So where to from, as we saw in the years following the 2008 crisis, governments need to make significant efforts to raise tax collections. With this context in mind, Keith, I'd like to bring you in on a first question. How do you think COVID-19 is likely to affect taxation policies in Africa, and when are these changes likely to come into place?
Yeah, look, that's the big question. A number of people ask me that, so I guess why you asked me as well, because of my Treasury experience. Look, I think the real issue here is you're going to have 2 phases. You're having the shock phase and then the post period, right? So in the shock, government is trying to do what it can to save the economy. So during the shock phase, you know, they're giving incentives. You can see it now, whatever incentive they can give. They're talking about, you know, subsidies to stimulate the economy, but there's only so much money. But right now, it's definitely don't hurt business, try to help it as much as you can. And you can see that in South Africa, you can see it elsewhere. A number of countries have enacted various forms of tax relief. Some are smarter than others. The smarter ones are talking about liquidity. The less ones are, you know, just random tax relief. So you'll see that probably from this year and next year, maybe even a little beyond. The problem is once you woke up from the party, you've had lots of incentives and you've drunk your wine and all of that. Then all of a sudden now you're like, wow, we've just spent all of that. We've gorged on incentives. The government's going to get up and go, oh my God, we've got a problem. And this is a bigger problem. So you talk about the 2008 crisis, you can talk about the 2000 crisis, you can go back. And the trends are that after every crisis, governments are becoming more and more indebted. Yep. And so you see 2 things going on. One, can we grow our way out of it? Right? If we grow our way out of it, well, then that's wonderful because the politician is popular, everybody is happy, and all goes forward. But then there's the other part, well, that somehow the growth doesn't seem to be covering that extended debt. And that debt overhang, as you know, in South Africa is now going to go to 80%. But if you look across the world, governments get increasingly indebted. And the problem for them is politically, they don't have the willpower to do something about it. So how do they do it? They're not going to do across the board tax cuts because that's unpopular. They get voted out of office. They don't like it. So they're going to find pockets. And that's what they did in 2008. They said, okay, where can we get it? Well, VAT was easier, right? We accelerated the trend toward indirect taxes. And then the magic pot of gold was get the foreigners because they don't vote. So you see that with Trump. You see that in Africa. Africa is very good. It's that anti-colonial thing. So what we saw in transfer pricing was definitely a protectionist mentality coming through. Now, the problem that they have is they're running out of ideas. We even saw that in the last crisis. So where are they going to get it? Well, I would say the first thing is Treasury will have unrealistic targets on the revenue service. That is the history of Africa, that the Treasury says, well, I don't know how to raise taxes. Revenue service, go out there and just collect more money. I think Namibia is the most ridiculous on it. So you'll definitely see that where the revenue authorities are going to be pushing aggression because they'll simply have no choice. Then the question is, can we maybe change the paradigm? Where is the free money or the excises? So that's where I generally see us going. But the problem is the options are running out. So you do hear Treasury in South Africa talking, saying, you know something? We have no choice but to get government. Believe it or not, that's out there. But yes, where is those new sources of revenue, such as digital tax, maybe things like that?
And as you say, I mean, it's a low growth environment that we're in, and yet revenue needs to be collected. So how do you do it? And Sebastian, one of the challenges is, as Keith mentioned, it took a while from the 2008 crisis for policies to be given. It was 2015 that the OECD gave their final reports on the BEPS action items. So what should companies be doing in this interim phase while they're waiting for any directional guidance or policy instruction in relation to COVID-19?
Thank you, Michael. And as Keith was describing, I think we are still in the shock phase, and this shock phase also applies to companies. So what I could see is that companies are currently involved in operational matters. And those operational matters were the management of the lockdown, the protection of employees, a number of immediate cost savings, and now, particularly in Europe, it's getting everyone back to work. So the tax angle to it was primarily in relation to cash and the spreading of cash for financing of operations across the world, simply to cover a number of salaries and fixed costs. Soon, in a couple of months, will come the tough decisions to be made. And by tough decisions, I mean notably the transfer pricing policy, which is a significant driver for profit allocation. And as I was discussing with the head of transfer pricing of a large multinational a few days ago, he was joking, saying that last year his job was about allocating profits across subsidiaries, and this year in 2020 his job will be about allocating losses. And how do you do that in the context of very limited guidance? And why do I say that there is limited guidance? I don't think that any tax regulation is stipulating anything with respect to loss allocation or extraordinary crisis. That's one. The OECD guidelines has indicated that they will try to provide guidelines, but it's likely that it will come in the later part of the year. So to the question, in 2020, meaning in the spring and in the summer 2020, how can companies make reliable and reasonable decisions with respect to the crisis and their international tax system? I would have three recommendations. First is do whatever you have to do from a business side, because first should come the operations. If some restructurings are needed, these restructurings need to take place. But where I see a role of the tax department, I know there are a number of participants to the webcast who are in finance or tax departments, is about documentation. The recommendation is to document contemporaneously, meaning now, the decisions that the management will make, because these decisions are generally sound, they make sense, they are commercially reasonable, but it's not in 3 years that it will be easy to document those decisions based on the facts available now. So documentation is key with respect to these matters. And thirdly, and I think we'll go back to this, Michael, is 2020 is still an arm's length year, meaning that the international tax system is still relying on the arm's length principle, being that decisions need to be commercially rationalized, and financial and economic analysis should be at the basis of any documentation of these restructuring or transfer pricing considerations.
Yeah. Excellent, Sebastian. And I mean, you made such a great point that we're making decisions now with the information we have available today. Like, you know, the benefit of hindsight is always a wonderful thing, but it's today that we are faced with limited information and we have to make decisions into an uncertain future. And you touch on documentation and supporting it and justifying and documenting, taking note now of the factors that you considered. Keith, what are your thoughts? If we don't do this, if we don't get this right and have the proper documentation and supporting, we don't consider all of the relevant considerations at place, what are some of the risks that we're likely to face?
Well, I think the question is you're going to be acting very quickly, and the group is going to be acting in the interest of the group. So, and that's what a group does, right? They're a multinational group. There's a CEO on top, and then there's a bunch of subsidiaries underneath. The group is worried about group survival, and they will think in a group way. And that will mean that it violates the transfer pricing principle, right? Because the transfer pricing principle, each company is independent. So you are going to react. Now, we can talk about documentation, but trust me, the CEO, that's not on the top of his list, right? What he's more worried about is, how can I save myself? I'm in the middle of a coma. Now, how do I save the body? So what you're first going to do is you're going to try to make sure to preserve cash wherever it is. And you're not going to be wanting to move cash around. You're trying to just make sure all costs are cut. Everything is to be saved. Now, in that environment, all of a sudden you're going to have a problem, because when you're doing things for the benefit of the group without thinking of the individual parts, then all of a sudden you're going to violate transfer pricing. It's going to happen. Now, you can defend yourself, because in COVID, let's talk about landlord and tenant. A lot of landlords are giving holidays, are giving cuts. So you can probably justify it. But I would go back to Sebastian's point, and I think what you're saying quite loud and clear is, maybe the documentation is important, not so much the length of it, but the timeliness. To say, we are doing this at this time for this reason, one page, based on limited information. I had to act in 2 days. Yes, you can look 3 years later of all the wonderful things I could have done. But as of this day, this is why we did what we did, knowing what we know now, and to keep that trail. Because that's the only way to do it. You're not going to be able to get that much information. You've got to act quickly.
I think that's such a great point. And I love the way that you say, look at it from the perspective of the group. You have to look at it from the perspective of the group. But from a transfer pricing point of view, you have to also look at it from the perspective of the other party to the transaction. And Sebastian, your firm that you're with, Accuracy, one of the things that you're involved in is helping companies through business rescue. And so you've seen a number of organizations grappling with, how do we help our affiliates in foreign jurisdictions? What are some of the decisions and some of the practical considerations you've seen companies grappling with to assist their affiliates in foreign jurisdictions?
Thank you, Michael. I think the first is very much about financing. So what I've seen is tax departments working hands in hands with the treasury departments to allow intra-group financing, immediate intra-group financing to a number of subsidiaries, which would also have the opportunity of local financing, but typically the intra-group financing would be cheaper. So this has been the immediate reaction by companies to manage the financing right, to manage the financial flows right, in order to cover immediate cost. I've not seen so far suspension of cross-border fees, typically management fees, technical fees, IP fees. I've not seen a situation where a group would suspend the charge of these services to give air to its subsidiary, but I would not be surprised that it would come, which then obviously creates a number of tax-related questions. And thirdly, what I've seen is the operational matters, for instance, respect to return goods. So we are in this situation where sometimes retailers have a transfer pricing policy where the main company, the supplier of the good, he has agreed to get back the goods at a certain price, which is fine in a normal pace of business, but when very large amount of inventories are sent back at a full price, this creates a significant financial exposure. And then comes the operational matters.
And I love those examples that you give. And some of them seem maybe a bit stretched and a bit far-fetched, but it reminds me of what we've seen in the oil price. I mean, whoever would have thought, if I'd said to you a few months ago that there was a related party and it's selling oil at a negative price, you would have told me that I'm exaggerating, I'm doing things out of context. But we've seen this playing out in third-party transactions. So there are these real decisions taking place. And I think the point that you highlight so nicely is companies at the moment, many of them, are faced with decisions not for tax purposes, but just for pure commercial decisions. And touching on, or bringing in the consideration that Keith mentioned on liquidity and your first example, Sebastian, on financing, let's jump to a polling question. And we'd like to elicit the support and responses of the audience here. So we've got a scenario where there's a South African company that has a subsidiary in Angola. The demand for the subsidiary's profits has dropped, and the entity needs money to pay for salaries. Management made the decision that they aren't going to retrench anyone. So if it isn't an option to inject equity, what should the company do? And now these are just some options that we have seen come up and be mentioned, but we'd like your thoughts as to which option would be most appropriate, or which option you think would be best. First option, ask a third-party bank in Angola for a loan. Secondly, provide interest-free loan from the parent company. And thirdly, stop the subsidiary from having to make payments to another group company for services rendered in the short to medium term. So please take a moment and just indicate what you believe the response should be. We'll give you another 5 seconds, and then we'll collate the answers and throw the question over to our speakers. So another 2 seconds. 1 second. Okay, let's have a look at the answers from this.
Yes.
I'm just going to pull it up. So yeah, you see a bit of the mixed bag. 33% went for option A, ask a third-party bank in Angola for a loan. 50% said ask for an interest-free loan from the South African parent. 17% said let's go knock on the doors and beg from an affiliate party and ask them to reduce the fees that we need to pay them. So Keith, how would you look at this? What do you think the relevant considerations are of this very simple little example?
Yeah, well, I think that, there's the tax considerations, but I think the first thing is going to be the commercial. What would you do commercially as a CEO? You're not, as I said, tax right now is down the list. It's an issue for you, but you're willing to take a risk there in light of the commerciality. So the issue of borrowing locally, well, do you want to borrow locally with certain interest rates? Now that's the best interest from a transfer pricing point of view, because it's a local transaction. You don't have to justify anything from transfer pricing. So from a transfer pricing point of view, that is clearly the best. But one, getting loans right now, how easy is that to extend your credit lines? You might be able to extend your credit line, your normal commercial credit line a little bit, so that some of that might be fairly easy for short-term liquidity. But if you're talking about large amounts, I can't see that being possible. Banks are suddenly not going to just extend credit lines all over the place. And then if they do, they're going to want a guarantee from a parent, right?
Yeah.
Definitely going to want that. And then you're going to be back in the same transfer pricing loop. So I don't see major increase in that, especially in Angola, because your capital is limited. And will a bank even be able to have that money to provide it? The second one, injecting money. Well, I guess the question is, do you want to inject money in new locations? So commercially, Angola, as you suggest, well, Angola is a great example because what do they have is oil. You don't want to fire anybody because you're going to need to keep that oil going. The price has gone up again. It's not what it used to be, but it's coming back. We all know that oil needs to be produced. So you're trying to keep your salaries going. But injecting a non-interest bearer loan, well, that immediately calls into question transfer pricing if you follow the form, right? So the moment you throw that in, sure, you should be getting a deduction if you're the payor, but the payee is going to have a notional interest. That's step one. Then step two, I think, as you've said, is Angola has a deemed notional interest charge for withholding. But even if they didn't have that, they could be, the Revenue Service could say, oh, you should have had a withholding. So we're going to have a notional charge on that side as well, forgetting about the deduction, because they'll play both sides. So the option is, dangerous from a transfer pricing point of view. And again, will you be able to get additional equity at this time from another location? And I don't think anybody wants to be moving. They probably have other higher priorities. The last one seems to be the most realistic. And maybe it's a little bit of one and a little bit of three, that you're saying, well, just stop moving cash. I mean, great, but we'll just stop moving cash. So we'll simply not charge, or the only other way to do it is to charge but not require payment. And then you can create a notional debt that way. And then maybe, but again, that will, once you have a notional debt, you have notional interest. So my gut is telling me it's 1 in 3. But yes, they're going to cause transfer pricing problems. There's no question about that.
So from what you're saying, I mean, there's no perfect easy answer. The one might be more expensive from a high interest rate from the bank compared to the funding rates that the parent could normally give. But the option 2 and 3, you've got to be especially 2, very conscious of the hidden costs. You talk about deemed withholding tax being applied if there's an interest-free loan to Angola, and your TP considerations from the parent. And option C, you've also got the TP consideration. So in even a seemingly simple little example, where 50% of the audience said, well, it should be this option, so much to unpack and consider. And to Sebastian's point, document.
Yes, I agree. And I think there you might not have a lot of documents. Again, you're going to have speed. You're going to say, look, this is what we did at this time, and this is why we did it. And you put down your commercial reasons for it. And then I guess the key thing, though, when you're doing it, you're saying from an arm's length point of view, this was the best mode of Angolan survival.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this all links in with the discussion of what is arm's length during a crisis? What is arm's length during COVID-19? And I mentioned this to our graphics designer, and this is what he came up with. Sebastian, I've got a feeling you've got a slightly different view on what is arm's length. And what do you think the considerations are for a company who's got transactions, cross-border transactions during the coming year? What's your view on how arm's length needs to be considered, Sebastian?
Thank you, Michael. And I agree with Keith's considerations on the former example. I think it's an extremely valid example. And I would simply add that I don't think that groups have a perfect understanding of the financial metrics of all their subsidiaries around the world. I mean, even though there are good information systems, I think that the cash requirements may be known on time, but the type of accounting profits that will likely be needed to be reforecasted for 2020, this information is not necessarily readily available. And also for certain companies, there will be a lag in the recognition of the impact of the crisis. If you think pharma, for instance, the stop of visits to doctors during the lockdown periods will have an impact on prescription drugs, but this will be seen in the accounts of companies maybe in the fall. So to the point about what decisions shall I made, not only there is little guidance, but it may also be that there is not exact visibility on time on the finance of all subsidiaries. So that reinforces the need to document, not in a sense of the compliant documentation, but document even in an informal way, all daily decisions that have been made and the information that was available at the time of the decision.
Sebastian, how important is it to consider the individual contexts of the different countries and the companies in the countries? So what I'm thinking about is, even if I look at relief packages being granted in third-party situations, a bank in one country might say, well, you've still got to pay your interest on the loan, but we'll defer that. You can make those interest payments in a few months' time, but you've still got to pay that. In other countries, it might be a case of saying, well, don't worry, you don't need to pay interest for a couple of months. Same with government supporting with salary payments for employees. In some countries, it's a small amount or nothing that's being compensated. In others, it's up to 80% of the salaries of employees. So how important is it to consider what might be arm's length in one country compared to what might be arm's length in another country?
Yeah, it's always the case that the country's perspective is the most relevant. And why is because if you look from the revenue authorities, they care about a specific subsidiary in a specific country within a set of specific circumstances. What the neighbors are doing is to a certain extent irrelevant. And therefore I fear that analysis will have to consider the specificities of each country, but still within a framework, meaning some principles that each company has to set respect to the treatment of this COVID-19 crisis. So a framework, a way of thinking needs to be put in place, and that need to be adjusted slightly from one country to the other, depending on the circumstances. And I believe that having a framework plus considering local specificities is very much what is arm's length. And you were asking me, Michael, about arm's length during this COVID-19 crisis. I would start by saying that arm's length was in danger before the COVID-19 crisis. There were attacks to the arm's length principle by a number of NGOs first, but now by some international institutions that were formulating before the crisis guidelines that were explicitly going beyond the arm's length principle, and new measures, new thinking were on the table before the crisis. So what does the crisis do to the arm's length principle? Does that reinforce the legitimacy of the attackers of the arm's length principle? On the contrary, that gives an opposite result. My personal view is it's both, because on one side, I think the crisis shows that there could be exceptional events, and that in case for international tax, we would have very rigid systems. And by rigid, I'm thinking of the formulary apportionment or very strict safe harbors. Then in case of the crisis, the distortions will be significantly higher than in a context which is more flexible, which is the basis of the arm's length principle. So on one side, I would say that the arm's length principle may be reinforced by the crisis, but on the other side, the opponents of the arm's length principle will quite easily say that the applicability or the easiness in applicability of the arm's length principle, which were the issues before, are even more the issues with the crisis, because we're seeing now that all multinationals are striving to find the external data points that are required by the arm's length principle, and that these data points are not there because of the lag in the availability of financial data for comparables. So depending on where we come from, we could have the COVID-19 crisis gives arguments to both sides, I would say.
That's very, very interesting, and seeing how to balance the way of looking at all of this. And Keith, these challenges, these questions of what is arm's length, or how do we get to arm's length price, and the other international tax related considerations, it's not new. We had these same questions back in 2008. But something has changed. What is it that's changed since 2008 compared to now?
Yeah, well, I think that the bottom line is our view of transfer pricing has evolved. So transfer pricing really, it's been long in coming. So when I was young, a long time ago, we heard about transfer pricing. We would spend maybe 20 minutes on it, and the professor would say, "This is coming." deal with it later. By the early 2000s, transfer pricing really wasn't that much of a focus for revenue authorities. They were sort of putting effort in. A few of them in the US and Britain and some of the Europeans were beginning to gear up, but mostly transfer pricing in the pre-2008 period was aggression. It was, you put resources, you hired the big accounting firms to manipulate the international tax system in order to lower your taxes. And that's where all the money was. Then once we came at 2008, finally the revenue authorities caught up. So now we began to see transfer pricing as a serious thing in the backdrop. And now, more and more of transfer pricing on a private side is about compliance and about reporting and all of that. So what we saw in the post-2000 period, the way to get revenue off of the multinationals was through transfer pricing. So we did see an effort. Now the question is, can you get more? Well, obviously, with this discussion of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, that's going on, there's a feeling that transfer pricing principles don't get enough revenue for them. So the question is, does Pillar 1 accelerate or not? Now, I'm not sure because a lot of the winners aren't there. I think right now for a year or two, because Emma's asked this question, I think at the moment we're going to probably see a slight slow in pillaring, but in Pillar 1. But then we're going to have to ask ourselves, can we get more revenue from those multinationals? But already you've tapped it out to an extent. You've already got it. It's not the free lunch. And even Pillar 1 isn't the free lunch. So there might be a push there, but I don't see that free lunch for them. But yes, you're going to have to do more. And then the answer always is more administration, more documentation. When in doubt, just ask for more and more information because nobody can object to that. And so you're just going to see a burying of that. God only knows what the documentation is going to look like this year, though.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, Keith, so it's similar sorts of questions that are coming up, but there's more transparency, there's more documentation, more sharing of information. So there's a lot more focus on this, and need to be able to explain all of your decisions, which could come under the spotlight. Yeah. Let's park the discussion on arm's length for a moment, and it links in with one of the questions that we've received from the audience. So Sebastian, prior to COVID-19, the OECD was looking into taxation of digitization of companies. What is the status of that work, and how do you think it'll be impacted by COVID-19? And what's likely to be the acceleration of levels of digitization?
Thank you, Michael. So I think what the COVID-19 crisis has shown is indeed a huge acceleration of digitalization, which then I assume necessitates or makes the need for a reform even more urgent. So where we were before the crisis, I think that the OECD mandated by the G20 had done an excellent job in gathering a large number of countries around a few reforms, specifically targeting the digital companies, but not only. The consumer-facing industries were within the scope of what Keith has described as Pillar 1. And in short, Pillar 1 was aimed at reallocating some profits to market jurisdictions. With respect to the digital business models, the market jurisdictions are where the users are. With respect to consumer-facing, the market jurisdictions are where the clients are. So to make a long story short, that's the reform includes some formulas, some thresholds, is targeting the largest companies and the most profitable, and assumes that the share of these most profitable companies' profits should be reallocated to the market jurisdictions, whatever their transfer pricing setup is in relation to these countries. So that's Pillar 1. There are some economics behind the Pillar 1 reform. Pillar 2 is a global minimum tax reform. It's a specific tax reform. There was a lot of energy before the COVID-19, a very clear path to succeed within a couple of months. I'm the latest information that we got from the OECD in relation to those reforms is that it's still on the agenda. The G20 has confirmed that obviously they have more urgent matters to deal with currently, but they still have the reform on digital taxation on the agenda. And Pascal Saint-Amand from the OECD has indicated that there were some discussions or negotiations with respect to the scope, notably of Pillar 1. Some countries are considering that the consumer-facing industry should be out. The US has had some positions in the past that are different from the others. But my view is that the reform will go on. It may take a few more months. There will be there may likely be some steps in the way the reforms are stipulated. But in any case, that's extremely welcome that some international tax reforms would take place with respect to the digital economy, because that's a demand by the publics, that's a demand by the politicians, and currently the situation is uncertain and unclear.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, and Keith, bringing you in on this question, I mean, if we think back to the example of Zoom, for example, of how that's grown and being used so much more than the bricks and mortar travel and the physical travel of the airline industry, et cetera, physical movement of people. What's your thoughts on the digitization of companies and the likely tax policies that will be introduced in the medium to long term?
Well, like just talking about, the movement toward working remotely. Well, obviously that's going to be a shift. And it's been a problem. Like in Africa, as you know, it's expensive to travel. So you're going to see an attempt to reduce that and stay within your borders and work remotely. Now that's a problem for transfer pricing, because in their, in the C/by-C reports, what are they looking at? They want to look where the employees are, where the capital is. They're looking for that physicality as proof of transfer pricing connection. Yeah. What you'll see is that's lost. And as that's lost and you're not traveling as much, you're not able to get a permanent establishment and so forth, you then see that pressure to maybe want to get that remote service, which is again talking about Pillar 1, where we want to change the paradigm, because even though it's not being produced in our country, we believe that it's economically connected to our country, and we're trying to change it. So I think that pressure will renew for some. Others will resist it, because if I've got my people operating in the United States and they're providing remote services, I'm not going to want the other guy to tax my people, because one of the pillars for basic taxation is your people work here, they are taxed here. So you saw that in South Africa, I put in 6 quin. Bottom line was people were working in South Africa and they were being charged remotely. And if they're rendering their service in South Africa doesn't want to give a credit. So if what we're going to see is digitalization charges and a lot of double taxation for dual claims, that's going to be a major problem here in order to try to get more revenue. But the question then is, how do you deal with that? You're trying to reduce that connectivity. And if they're going to go beyond, well, then what you're going to find is that maybe people are going to reconsider and start to disengage. We might see more of isolationist policies, and maybe multinationals will say, this global paradigm, we need to reconsider and make sure there's really a profit margin worth fighting for.
And I suppose that's the big conundrum, because that's the trend that we're seeing, the move towards digitization. At the same time, we want to be very careful against stifling that trend, because the greater the extent of services being provided cross-border, intra-Africa, and the use of technology intra-Africa, that's going to stimulate growth. That will stimulate job opportunities. That will stimulate the technology being developed in the continent. So on the one hand, you've got to look at how do we tax the trends that are arising, but at the same time, we've got to think very carefully, how do we make sure we don't stifle those trends and we really encourage those trends?
I agree. I think my worry is this. Look, I think everybody accepts there must be tax on services, fine. But what you can't have is double taxation.
Yeah.
And when you're seeing the paradigm sort of changing, sort of not, what really is happening is as you know, the bulk of trade is now services. It's no longer goods. Now, the remote is going to change the nature of that services, but still there's cross-border services. So, Africa's talking about reducing customs charges, but what you'll really see maybe is more customs charges on services effectively. So digitalization taxes, not like Uganda's tax of not giving input for imported services. You then say, oh, we want to change the pillar. You start adding those costs in. The companies don't mind paying a certain level of tax, but they don't want to pay double tax. That's the issue. And so will companies then say to themselves, the price is becoming too high? If it's too high, maybe it's not worth it. And maybe we start cutting back. And so the double tax is the real problem. And I don't see an international consensus. Even in Pillar 1, you can see that consensus isn't there, because there's going to be some winners and losers. And the losers are not going to play along nicely. If they have the economic power, they're not going to go along. It's really going to be who has the economic power to do what.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just coming back to this whole period of uncertainty, where we haven't yet seen seen a lot of guidance. There has been some pockets of guidance as to what policies should be considered or how they should be adapted and looked at. I mean, the OECD's given some guidance. South Africa's given a little bit of guidance. Some other countries given some guidance. But Sebastian, during this period of uncertainty, what would you really like to see from revenue authorities in terms of communication for taxpayers that are trying to navigate through these uncharted waters?
I think multinationals are very much eager to get information and guidance from tax authorities through circulars or memos or any indication that may help them navigate these exceptional crises. And it's not out of reach, and it's possible it has been done before. Certain tax authorities have published, for instance, ranges of the profits that they would be expecting for certain industries. I'm thinking of the Australian tax office for certain industries as well. And from my understanding, this has been welcomed, because then you have a better understanding of the expectations from the other side. That would be one. And then internally, I think it's essential for a revenue authority to have a consistent framework of apprehending the same subjects, meaning that there is a global understanding of the matters within the tax authorities, and generally it can be a few lead people that are the most knowledgeable about transfer pricing, and that they are spreading their thinking, respect to, and their views throughout the revenue authorities, so that there is a consistent treatment from one tax officer to the other. Yeah. And there, I think there have been lots of discussions about domestic resource mobilization, the need for technical assistance, capability building, reinforcement of capabilities. This is indeed very much welcomed. I think that would be welcomed by all parties. So that would be the third pillar.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. I see we have got a couple of questions that have been coming in. So one of the questions is, we expect many losses in most jurisdictions in 2020. It will recover in 2021. So I don't expect this to be a long-term trend, short-term blip. What are your comments on this? Does transfer pricing need to be adjusted at all if it's potentially going to be a short-term blip? Any thoughts on that, Keith or Sebastian?
Yeah, well, I guess the question is, do you believe in the arm's length principle? Look, should you make special rules for COVID? Well, maybe for a year if you want to go after that. But I think the real question is, do you believe the transfer pricing, concept is correct? Now, a lot of us are more traditionalists. So I think most of the traditionalists would say the arm's length principle is fine. The question was, Pillar 1 was saying they didn't like it, because what they were saying was, we really want to be taxing on a different basis. You can see that in Africa, that they go, okay, well, transfer pricing is transfer pricing, but when it comes to services, we want to tax the consumption of the services from abroad. That's what the UN rule is saying. It really is moving it to a consumption basis, and trying to justify transfer pricing as the consumption is the value add. And I think that's a stretch, and I've been uncomfortable with that. So really, does it need to be changed? Well, theoretically, I think the transfer pricing principle is sound. The question is, do countries want to change this as a way of altering their revenue to get more from abroad, and does it make sense? And I'm not sure if it does make sense. I'm actually, very suspicious of Pillar 1, but I'm not allowed to say that too.
And I suppose it very much depends on what are the dynamics at play. Only change a system if it's going to improve it or make sense to do it. In terms of companies and their transfer pricing, well, you've got to look at the commercial reality. From a commercial point of view, do you need to make a decision to change or not to change? And I think it's got to be, to Sebastian's point earlier, driven by the commercial reality. Another question that's come
can
up
I say, Michael, can I say a few words? I think that, first, that's an excellent question. Second, unfortunately, in the tax field, I think revenue authorities are looking at from one year to the other, so it's still a single fiscal year that is looked at, which means that in 2021, 2022, they will look back at 2020 in isolation, which prevents, except in certain countries, some smoothing out or averaging, or at least that was my past experience with revenue authorities. And respect to this, the key issue, which is this COVID-19 losses, I would call them even the lost profits. There was an expectation in the budget of a profit, and there have been lost profits. Which parties within the group should be apportioned these profits? I think this is really the key matter. I would still, even though 2021 is likely to be as good as 2019, I would still look at 2020 in isolation and assess to which extent some share can be allocated locally. For example, thinking of distributors, or in any case, which party should be apportioned the COVID-19 lost profits. So the recovery in 2021 should not prevent some analysis for 2020.
I think that's an excellent point, Sebastian. So thank you for raising that. Another question we've got is, do you think it's likely that governments will use COVID-19 as an opportunity to bring much needed economic reform into place to create more certainty and stimulate economic growth? And I would like to dovetail that with a thought that Trevor Manuel has been quoted as saying a while ago. Trevor Manuel's statement is, never waste a crisis. And my question to both of you, perhaps Keith, we'll start with you and then Sebastian, is what can be done by taxation stakeholders to not make sure we don't waste this crisis as far as possible?
Yes. Okay, well, there are two sides. You're talking about private sector or you're talking about government. Now, from a private sector point of view, I think never waste a crisis is, from a commercial point of view, I would reevaluate my global supply chain. And I think that's what they're going to do because, well, transfer pricing won't be the main issue. I mean, there's the issue of, we felt that a global supply chain was wonderful and there was no downsides to it. So once you have COVID, the question is, global supply chains carry lots of risk. So there's a lot of discussion about maybe we need to revisit this global supply chain and reduce the locations. Second of all, markets. There are a number of markets that probably haven't been doing well for a while. I know a number of companies that complain. They go, some of these markets are actually losing us money. But it's very hard to realize a loss. So if I'm a CEO, this is the time to walk away. To say, well, COVID has overwhelmed us. Probably been losing money anyway in a little while. Let's just expose our losses. Let's clear our accounts and all the things that we can see, because not only this year, but years ahead, are not going to do great, the risk becomes too great. And so let's clean up our mess and shrink down. We're doing that locally. So I would say that a number of markets would have to be revisited commercially, and that's what I would do from their side point of view. And then you then ask yourself, use the transfer pricing principles to your advantage. Say, look, does this thing really justify profit there? for the country, because it does get you to focus. Is this profit line really worthwhile if you look at that company? And if it's not, well, then maybe the transfer pricing is your skill to tell you that maybe we should shut this thing down and revisit it. So that's from a company point of view. The problem is from a government point of view, how do they react? And how do they change their policy? So one question was there, do they change their economic policy? Well, they should have been doing it all along anyway. So the question is, can government say, well, now in the middle of this crisis, now that we're up against the wall, are we going to play a smarter game? The difficulty is I don't see the underlying dynamics changing on their side. So yes, maybe we can target some things better, but the problem is the old problems remain. They're just in magnified form. So I see that government is going to probably be able to get quick charges. That's what I'm afraid of. The purpose of Pillar 1 is to avoid indirect customs charges on services like digital taxes. That was the promise that some of the OECD people said, that we'll avoid these charges through the new pillar. But I think what you're gonna find is they're gonna put the new charges on because they're easy. They're gonna do desperate attempts with incentives at the same time. And then this Pillar 1 will be taken up by those who benefit. So unfortunately, the wasting of the crisis I think it's going to get more government schizophrenic policy.
Okay. Thank you very much, Keith. Sebastian, just in 20 seconds, anything you'd like to just add on to what Keith has mentioned?
So I agree with Keith's observations. I would simply add that crises are typically trends accelerators. And I think we need to all wish for the best trends to be accelerated as opposed to trade and customs wars. And I hope that this crisis will illustrate that the level of uncertainty that is currently occurring in the international tax landscape is now unbearable. And that we're seeing here, and thank you again for organizing this series of webcasts, because nobody knows, especially on the company size, what to do, because they would not know what will be the expectations by revenue authorities. So trying to diminish the level of uncertainty in the international tax landscape, I think should be the ultimate goal after this crisis.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Sebastian. Now, perhaps we just try to bring all of the points that have been discussed, and I'd like to really just thank Keith and Sebastian. It's been fantastic hearing your insights and different perspectives. So just a huge thank you for what you've shared. And if we just look to bring these various points together, we've just jotted these down in a couple of slides that we'll show you and just go through very briefly. So firstly, before COVID-19, there was uncertain, intense international tax context, stemming partly from 2008 and the BEPS outcomes. Then secondly, COVID-19 will likely, to Sebastian's point, be an accelerator of these trends in both developed and emerging markets. A third observation is that in the midterm, we're hoping for a more stable, simple and well-accepted international tax system. That would be the ideal, and any communication coming out would be really beneficial. Multinationals are perceived, rightly or wrongly, as wealthy units, and they will likely be targeted for extra collections. And that's what we saw from the 2008 crisis. So to the extent that the tax base can be broadened through this crisis, I think that would certainly be a really positive outcome of this. To the extent that revenue authorities communicate their expectations now, during the crisis, we are likely to have greater levels of compliance and hopefully reduce some of the potential controversy in future. Then, in terms of it's likely that the uncertain environment that corporates will face in the 2021 and onwards, corporates should be preparing now to adhere to the post-BEPS rule. In other words, just make sure that your economic contributions align with the value realization. Secondly, document contemporaneously in 2020 all decisions made and their commercial rationality. I think that point has been stressed a lot during our discussion today. Then establish internal pricing to allocate COVID-19 losses based on how third parties would have done so. considering the local context of the different entities. Then secure such positions or decisions upfront with tax authorities if at all possible. Sometimes that might be APAs or in certain cases advanced tax rulings if that's available in a particular country, but try to get that certainty. And lastly, one size doesn't fit all. We saw that with the industries and that divergence of industries. Some industries doing well in this time, others really, really battling. Others will have a short-term impact, while others are a much longer-term impact. So I'd like to thank you all for taking time to join us. I really hope that this time was helpful and insightful. There's a lot more discussion that we need to be having over the next several weeks, and hence we've got a lineup of other interesting discussions. I'd encourage you to join the one in 2 weeks' time. If you found this one helpful and beneficial, please invite anyone else you think might be helpful. We're going to be discussing supply chains and value chains and the impact of digitization on trade in Africa. We have a fantastic panel again lined up for that discussion, so I'm really looking forward to that. We want to make this series as beneficial and helpful to you as possible, so we're going to be doing a couple of additional things as well. The one is straight after this webinar, there's going to be a survey. I'd like to ask you just take 1 minute, that's all. Complete it, give suggestions, what else would be helpful. Secondly, there's going to be a handout that's going to be circulated shortly to everyone who's attended this with practical suggestions as to things that you should be looking at, especially with regards to your transfer pricing during this time. We're going to, as we end this particular webinar, play a very short video just introducing the topic for 2 weeks' time. So please stay tuned for that, or stay on the line. It's a short video. But from me and the rest of the team at Graphene Economics, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you once again to our fantastic speakers. And stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.